So the theme of the SOFA 2021, as it was mentioned by the Director General, is about agri-food systems and how we can make them more resilient to shocks and stresses. This comes as an urgency as what we have observed under COVID-19 pandemic. Clearly, we also saw on the COVID-19 pandemic that agriculture was resilient, but we need to be prepared and we need to increase the level of resilience of the agricultural system. The publication presents new country-level indicators on the resilience of agri-food systems and provides guidance on how countries can prioritize policies and interventions to assure resilient agri-food systems for our future. So let me start moving with the presentation. The report clarifies the meaning of agri-food systems resilience and provides a framework for analyzing it. It proposes a way of measuring the degree of national food system resilience through a suite of indicators for over 140 countries. And this is central because it will allow us to understand from the country perspective where we have to do improvements. The indicators are intended to assess national agri-food systems' capacity to absorb the impact of a shock and provide guidance to policymakers on areas of improvement. These indicators are linked to the 4 key functions of the agri-food systems, that is to ensure robust primary production, availability of food, physical access to food, and economic access to food. The report also identified the main factors underpinning resilience in rural households. It also provides guiding principles for building resilience to buffer against shocks and stresses at all levels of the agri-food systems. The guiding principles for policymakers emphasize the importance of preparing for foreseen and unforeseen disruptions using a system-wide, multi-risk, multi-actor, and multi-sectoral approach that incorporates the broader policy implications for resilience. Let me say that this is the first time that we look at the whole agri-food system to look at the different levels in which we have to tackle the increase in resilience, and not only at the household, which traditionally has been made up. Attention to the need of resilient agri-food system has brought up, as I mentioned before, by the COVID-19, where we have seen a significant increase of undernourishment, up to 161 million more people being undernourished, and especially 3 billion people that don't have access to healthy diets. But also this is something that has been raised in the UN Food System Summit, which is called for building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks, and stresses to ensure the continued functioning of healthy and sustainable food systems. What we bring in this report is how we can operationalize this and how we can do an assessment through the indicators that we're going to present so that countries can target the agri-food system transformation pathway to build the resilience that is needed for the system. On this background, this report aims to help guide action for building resilient agri-food systems, leveraging the power of these systems to deliver progress on all SDGs and not least on SDG 2. Agri-food systems include a set of interlinked activities that encompass primary production, whether farming, breeding, or cash, or both food and non-food products, as well as all other activities required to bring food to our plates, from food storage, processing, transportation, marketing, and more. And it also is interlinked to the health system, it's interlinked to the transportation system, it's interlinked to the environment, and to many other systems around. And those direct and indirect links are essential. And food plays a crucial role, as we all know. We always, when we started COVID-19, we keep saying that there was no health without food. And that's why we needed to keep our value chains alive and why we need to keep increasing the resilience of this sector. But they also include consumers who need both physically and economic access to sufficient and nutritious food and interact with non-food supply chains through the purchase of inputs and the provision of inputs for the production of non-food products. Because of the vastness of the agri-food system, they are vulnerable to shocks and stresses of different origins, environmental, economic, or social, which are also the key drivers when we look at undernourishment and food insecurity. Resilience of agri-food systems is about their ability to withstand such shocks. And resilience refers to the set of characteristics that allow agri-food systems to sustainably ensure availability of and access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for all over time in the face of any disruption. Agri-food system resilience focuses on all 6 dimensions of food security, which I present in this slide, but more specifically on stability of access and sustainability to ensure short and long-term food security and nutrition for all. Now, to be resilient, agri-food systems depend on 5 distinct capacities, which I show in the slide. The first one is preventive capacity, the ability to reduce risks and to avoid the creation of new risks. The second one is anticipative capacity, the ability to take early action in anticipation of a potential threat to reduce negative impacts. The third element is absorptive capacity, which is the ability to withstand shocks and stresses and bounce back afterwards to preserve and restore essential basic structures and functions, and if possible, to even get better when you build back. The fourth is adaptive capacity, the ability to make incremental changes to a system to preserve its core functions. And finally, transformative capacity, the ability to create a fundamentally new system when ecological, economic, or social structures make the system one unattainable. The main focus of this report is on the absorptive capacity. And why we are doing this? FAO has been providing long-standing support to countries on risk management strategies for shocks such as droughts, floods, pests, which can be anticipated based on past experience. However, agri-food systems also need to be able to absorb unforeseen shocks, such as those caused by the sudden lockdowns during the early stages of the COVID-19 and the ones we are currently facing. So building absorptive capacity requires designing and investing in diversified responses. It also depends on institutions that coordinate them and the robustness of the infrastructure in which they rely. So that's why we highlighted in a different color here the absorptive capacity, which is where this report is focusing. And of course, FAO is working in all the other dimensions of resilience capacities. This report brings 4 newly developed indicators to measure the absorptive capacity of the agri-food systems at the national level. The first is the Primary Producing Flexibility Index, PPFI, which measures the absorptive capacity of a country's primary agricultural sector. If we need to keep the agricultural sector alive and the production alive, we need to understand how resilient this sector is. The second indicator is the Dietary Sourcing Flexibility Index, DSFI, which measures the absorptive capacity of food supply. It's availability of food for our consumers. The third measure is the resilience of transport networks, which we have seen are essential for physical access to food, and which we have seen how vulnerable we were at the beginning of the COVID-19. The last indicator measures the economic access to a healthy diet during times of crisis, building on estimates that were presented on the State of Food Security and Nutrition, the SOFI 2021 report. This is extremely important because today we face a challenge of access to healthy diets. 3 billion people don't have access to healthy diets, but we need to understand what will happen if there is a shock of over-income and how consumers will react to that, and how this number, which is already terrible, will get even worse because of that situation. So let me start with the first indicator, the Primary Production Flexibility Index, which aims to measure the absorptive capacity of a country's primary agricultural sector by looking at 2 aspects. First, the diversity of commodities produced in the country, how diverse our supply is at the country level, which is central for access to healthy diets. And second, the diversity of output markets for these commodities, both domestic and international. The premise is that more diversified is the composition of both production and marketing challenges, the easier is to absorb a demand shock. Looking at this graph, country B has a higher absorptive capacity than country A because it produces a more diverse set of commodities and then sells them on a more diverse set of domestic and international markets. This indicator can help policymakers to determine which elements of production and trade add to the absorptive capacity and hence contribute to the resilience of the country's primary production sector. And this indicator was estimated for 181 countries. Here we present the result for 181 countries. And it shows the PPFI results for each country split into its 3 main components. The diversity of domestic production in terms of commodity produced and sold to the domestic market, represented in the vertical axis, the y-axis. The diversity of exports in terms of commodity exported and trading partners, represented in the x-axis. And the third dimension, which is the balance between domestic sales and exports, represented by the size of the bubble. The bigger the bubble, the closer we are to a 50-50 split with respect to domestic production and the diversity of exports. The downward sloping diagonal lines from left to right sum export and production diversity, where countries along the same line report the same diversity level, for example, 0.4, 0.5, or 0.6. Countries are placed very differently in the graphic. However, some patterns emerge. Some countries, those in the blue oval that we show in this first graph, which include China and India, show very low level of export diversification and often a high dependence on domestic markets. However, this is compensated in part by very high level of domestic production diversity, allowing them to obtain a high overall value of the PPFI, and hence absorptive capacity of primary production. They nevertheless remain vulnerable to domestic economic downturns because something happened inside those countries, their own local production, which is diversified, will be affected. And of course, that will affect the level of resilience of these countries. And that's why they are in the bottom left top corner, where they show significant diversity in local markets, but low diversity in terms of their exports that they produce because of the high level of population. The countries in the green oval show the higher degree of export diversification, often combined with relative high diversity of domestic production. They generally have a balanced mix of exports and domestic sales. This is the size of the bubble, as I mentioned before. Adding further to the overall value of the PPFI, and many of these are high-income countries with open trade policies, such as Australia, or part of the large trading blocs like the European Union. Many countries, however, those in the purple oval, rely essentially on a more limited domestic production diversity for their absorptive capacity, with little export diversification and a low reliance on export markets. These vulnerable countries with a low PPFI value are mostly low-income countries with little external trade and most production consumed locally. However, it is important to underline that while a high value of the PPFI is positive in terms of ensuring resilience, there is no optimal composition of the PPFI. And here, clearly, a huge country such as China or India can hardly be expected to see a large contribution to the export diversification because they need to satisfy their local demand. And therefore, they won't be exporting too much and high diversification in terms of export. But there are other countries which are not of such a level of population that will be able to combine both, even small countries like the case of Netherlands. In summary, the PPFI is a useful tool for countries to analyze their specific situation in terms of vulnerabilities and possible entry points to improve their resilience. Let me now move to the second indicator, the Dietary Sourcing Flexibility Index. In a certain sense, thanks to the previous indicator around, indeed, it captures the multiplicity of different pathways through which a unit of food can be made available to a consumer. So here we are focusing more on consumer access to food. This diversity of pathways of food supply has three components: the diversity of domestic production for the domestic market or to be exported, the diversity of imports and trade partners, and the diversity of food stocks held from the previous years. Again, country B has a higher absorptive capacity than country A, as it can be shown in the diagram, because not only does country B produce a more diverse set of agricultural commodities and holds a more diverse set of food reserves, but it also imports from more countries a more diverse set of products, which gives them a higher resilience because they have more flexibility if something happened to one of these countries from where they procure their food. The more the options in terms of sourcing food, the higher the absorptive capacity of these countries. Let us show the results for the different countries. And the diversity of pathways of food supply in this indicator is estimated for 153 countries and is depicted in the graph across the countries as follows. The diversity of domestic production in terms of commodities produced and then sold in the domestic market or exported is represented in this graph in the y-axis. The diversity of imports in terms of the commodities imported and trading partners is represented in the x-axis. And the food that countries have stocked from previous years is represented by the size of the bubble. Those are the stocks. The diagonal lines sum the import and production diversity, where countries along the same line report the same level of diversity level for 0.4, 0.5, or 0.6. From the graph, two main results will emerge when we start looking at the results. First, countries diversify their food supply in different ways, either through domestic production or relying more on imports or even buffer stocks. And second, this indicator value depends on only to a certain extent on country size or income level. And now we're going to see the level of the diversity for the different income levels. So again, For this indicator, a high overall value indicates a high level of absorptive capacity. And here we're showing the high-income countries, where we see a significant level of absorptive capacity in most of the cases. Also, when we look at different income levels, upper middle income levels, we see that absorptive capacity starts to reduce, but still is significantly higher. And when we continue with lower middle income, the yellow bubbles that are appearing now, we see again a reduction of this capacity of countries to procure food from different sources. And finally, the red bubble shows the low-income countries where we observe the weaknesses and how they require a significant level of resilience to be able to achieve these goals. One third indicator measures the country food transport network resilience. This became extremely important when we were looking at what happened with COVID-19, especially at the beginning of the period. A robust transport network supports agri-food systems resilient to shocks and stresses and guarantees physical access to food at the local level. Yet, for half of the 90 countries analyzed, the closure of a critical transport route, one critical transport route, could increase travel time. This is travel time where it is produced and where it is supplied or made it available to the consumer, the destination. And this increase has an impact of 20% or more for food diverted from the disrupted route, potentially affecting food costs for 845 million people, only disrupting one route. The effects are more local in some countries than in others, and the share of population potentially affected ranges from 25% in Nigeria to 78% in South Africa. So the vulnerability to the transportation network is central, and that's something that we clearly observed during COVID-19. And finally, when we focus to the consumers, we have our measure of vulnerability in economic access to food estimated for 143 countries. Indeed, not only does food need to be available, people also need to have economic access to it, or in other words, be able to afford it. We look at how the shock in terms of a reduction in income will affect people's access to healthy diet. Based on estimates from the 2021 State of Food Security and Nutrition in the world, the SOFI report, already we know that today 3 billion people couldn't afford healthy diets. But now we have estimated that an additional 1 billion people could be unable to afford it if their incomes were reduced by 1/3. We have seen even larger income shocks in countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. In Cambodia, for example, more than 60% of people affected suffered income loss of 1/3 of it or more, while 90% suffer a 1/5 or more. So this could happen. Similarly, in Brazil, a study of Brazil doctors found that of those whose income was affected, 31% experienced a reduction of 25 to 50%, and about 60% a reduction over 50%. And the report showed most examples in this regard. So this is something that happened and could continue to happen. If we look at it by region, the majority of the 1 billion people are found in Asia, with approximately 731 million, followed by Africa with 117 million. But even in the Americas and Europe, approximately 87 and 22 million will be at risk. And we clearly observed that during COVID-19, where, for example, Latin America was significantly affected by the shock of the economic downturn resulting from COVID-19. So this illustrates the extreme vulnerability to shocks affecting people's income. The additional 1 billion will mostly live in lower and middle income countries. And in low income countries, where already a large majority cannot afford a healthy diet, the challenge is even more dramatic in this country group in the face of the same 1/3 cut in income. An additional 62 million people, approximately 12% of the population, will not be able to afford even an energy-sufficient diet, consisting mainly of starchy staples that provide the energy needed for a days of work. The continuous function of the agri-food systems and the agri-food system chains is essential to ensure a smooth, stable, and sustainable flow of food to all. Diverse, redundant, and well-connected food supply chains enhance agri-food systems resilience by providing multiple pathways of producing, sourcing, and distributing food. Acknowledging these are different types of food supply chains around the world, classified as traditional, transitional, and modern. And within them, business of varying scales, they require each different business strategy and priority action areas that facilitate adjustment during the shocks and contribute to resilience. Yet for almost all types of food supply chains, building resilience will require costly investments and may entail trade-offs with efficiency and with inclusiveness. Mostly large companies with sufficient investment capacities can overcome trade-offs with efficiency, and they can be very flexible because of economies of scope. However, many small and medium agri-food enterprises risk being pushed out of the business as the lack of these capacities. And the consequent increase in unemployment and loss of livelihoods may outweigh gains from increased resilience. And we have seen this with the informal sector especially. Careful consideration of these trade-offs is necessary to minimize them or even turn them into synergies. Improved food system chain coordination and organization through consortia and agri-territorial tools can enable these small and medium enterprises to create synergies between resilience, inclusiveness, and efficiency. And government support is also key to create an enabling environment for improved coordination and to overcome trade-offs, for example, through public investment in infrastructure and research. Now, how about household livelihoods, which depend on these agri-food systems? Building resilience of rural households is an objective in its own, and it helps to improve their livelihoods, but it also renders agri-food systems more resilient. Rural households experience shocks and stresses differently, based on their socioeconomic characteristics, social protection, and other support programs, and whether they primarily sell or buy food, and also on their assets. Predominantly female-headed households are worst affected by shocks and stresses, due in most part to women's lack of access to land and to other assets. Enhancing rural household resilience will require investing in education, especially for strengthening women's resilience, and diversifying incomes. For those living in harsh conditions, such as pastoral households, access to basic services like clean water and sanitation is also key. The success of household resilience strategies will also depend on the wide range of interventions to improve risk management and resilience capacity at multiple levels of the agri-food systems. But we need to understand that households and farmers are within the agri-food system, and therefore there is complete interlinkage, and it's not just touching the households and the farmers, but also touching the whole system, as this report and as the indicators have shown in this report. Now, how we do build more resilient agri-food systems? And as was mentioned by the Director General, the report proposes 3 guiding principles and subsequent entry points. The first guiding principle is that resilience involves preparing for disruptions, particularly those that cannot be anticipated. In terms of action, this calls for enhancing the resilience of national agri-food systems through ensuring diversity in food sources and output markets. It also calls for managing connectivity through more robust transport infrastructure and logistics, something that we have slowed down lately, and we need to again reactivate and start to increase. The third entry point focuses on enhancing the resilience of food supply chains, again allowing diversity in terms of a mix of different and heterogeneous suppliers is central to this. The final entry point focuses on enhancing the resilience capacities of small-scale producers and vulnerable households. This can be done through improved access to assets, to diversify sources of income and social services, social protection programs that can also improve household resilience in the event of these shocks. The second guiding principle recognizes that resilience building is a system-wide, multi-risk, multi-actor, and multi-sectoral approach. This requires analyzing of each component of the agri-food systems and the specific risks they face. Doing so may require to expand and improve country-level information to better inform policy design and to guide investments, and to understand the interlinkages with other sectors, like the health sector, for example. And finally, broader policy issues have important implications for resilience. First and foremost, guaranteeing access to healthy diets must be a priority. Other policy areas that contribute to households' resilience are health and education services, and policies to promote gender equality. Policies promoting sustainability of agri-food systems through a stewardship of the environment also contributes to resilience. With 10 years to go until 2030, action along the entry points of all these entry points is needed if we are going to build resilience and achieve zero hunger. And if we are going to really take seriously the agri-food system transformation that countries are asking for, we need to take this into consideration. Let me finish this report by thanking the whole team that was behind this work. The team was led by Andrea Cataneo with the supervision of Marco Sanchez, Scott Jacob, which played a crucial role together with Ahmad Sadin, Teresa McMemoni, Sarah Vaz, and Daniela Veronica, which also helped in all the design. I also want to thank the team, my office, Paola Percy and Chris, which also helped to organize this meeting with all the other teams. So thank you very much to this great team that has created an amazing report this year. Thank you very much. Back to you. And I think, as John Hoynock mentioned when he presented, we used to focus a lot on the household, on the individual, in the work we did in resilience in the past, and that was great. We really innovate, like the RIMA work and many of the work that we have been done also with other partners. But what we have found out now, what we figure out is the interlinkages, and that's what this report brings, the importance of the interlinkages, and how we need to assess resilience at the different levels of the supply chain, from producer to consumer, but also backward linkages to input markets. For example, today we are facing a problem with energy, which is completely interrelated to the agricultural sector and is affecting the input markets of fertilizers. So we need to better understand those. And what the report brings today is a photograph of the situation using the 4 indicators: the primary production, the food supply, the transport networks, and economic access to healthy diets. That's the photograph that we can observe for each of the countries. And our job and our work together with countries is to take this photograph and based on that to try to assess what will be the consequences and how we can increase resilience in those different dimensions. And what are the bottlenecks why we are not having that level of resilience on those dimensions. That's the work that we have to do with the countries so that we can help release those constraints and we can help resolve the challenge and increase the resilience of those countries in the 4 dimensions. Clearly, this is not an issue of being self-sufficient or having access to international markets. It's an issue of the combination of both. That's what we are looking for. That's why the combination will vary country by country, but that diversity, as it was mentioned as one key element, is what will increase the resilience. Now, the situation that we face today of climate change, which basically is increasing uncertainty, is increasing variability, not only extreme temperatures, but also the variability, the variance of what could happen, makes this report extremely important, together with other shocks because of the interlinkages like the health shocks, the pest and diseases shocks, and many others that could happen to us, and which brings an uncertainty component. And being prepared by increasing the resilience in these 4 dimensions, I think, will be the way to work together with countries. Back to you. But I think there are very important issues that we brought in this report. And the first one is the importance of data and the importance of indicators that can help us understand and process that data so that we understand the situation we are facing. The second element, which for me is central in this report, is the importance of understanding the interlinkages that we are facing. We can no longer treat the agricultural sector just as production. The agricultural sector has interlinkages in the value chain, but also with other sectors. And for that, we need to carefully think how we can increase resilience of this sector. Agriculture has shown during COVID-19 that it is resilient. Nobody really faced a situation where there was no food in their countries. Almost all countries have access to food. Of course, there are conflicts and other problems that restrict access to food. But the COVID-19 only disturbed the supply chains at the beginning, but the sector adjusted and immediately reacted to it. But this needs to be increased. So this is a lesson learned. It's good what we were able to do, what the sector was able to do, and what the farmers and the producers and intermediaries were able to do. But we need to keep increasing this resilience because we could be facing stronger shocks and shocks that come in a higher frequency. And for that is central to improve. So the interlinkages are central. Third, we need to do and target effectiveness of interventions at country level. And what this brings is the indicators that we are observing today as a photo, where we can clearly go in detail and try to understand what countries can change to increase their resilience across the agri-food system. And finally, I think we need to work together with partners. Every sector has its own expertise, but bringing the pieces together and bringing the linkages together, understanding that what happens in one place will create a trade-off in another place, I think will be central to be able to build up this resilience together. No country by itself will resolve the problem. We know that we have a huge problem of access to healthy diets, and there are continents that depend on availability of food across borders. So we need to work with what we have, and we need to keep improving to achieve the goal that we have still for the 2030, which is SDG 2, and for us also SDG 1 and SDG 10, and of course all the interlinkages with other SDGs. So thank you so much, Yasmin, and thank you to the team for this amazing work, and to all the panelists for being with us, and all of you that has been here for this long period of time. Thank you very much. Back to you.